I always went to the same supermarket I'd gone to essentially my whole life. It was a ritual to swing by after work a few days each week and pick up dinner for the family, along with a few other groceries. I contemplated breakfast cereal choices as I stared at the same cracked vinyl tile in the same aisle I've stood in many times before, with the same old-school luminescent light bulbs flickering overhead. As much as it might have embarrassed me when I was younger to say, my guilty pleasure has always been sugary cereal. Ever since I was a kid, I've always been a fan of whatever had marshmallows in it, especially the ones everyone saw on TV. They're magically delicious, I thought to myself, while reminiscing of those old commercials, and opted to buy the name brand for once instead of the knockoffs that tasted half stale most of the time. I felt even more amused when I noticed the upper top label that promised a special surprise in that limited edition run of boxes. I normally wouldn't have gone for any of this, but my wife had already informed me that her and the kids would be having dinner with her parents that night, and not to expect them home before I went to bed. I usually left for my job at the walnut packing factory every morning at 4:30 a.m., so I usually tried to be in bed by 9:30. So I thought, why not just enjoy a bowl of cereal before bed on this particular evening? Truth be told, I'd lived out the usual cliche of marrying my high school sweetheart and never leaving the small town I'd grown up in. I'd planned to pursue a career as an engineer, but my collegiate career was cut short by baby number one when I was 19 years old. So, I did the right thing and got a job at the walnut processing factory, and just summed up the whole rest of my life with that. By the time the third kid had arrived, my one-time sweetheart was now constantly enraged by the sight of me. There were many nights that she and the kids, who were now teenagers and also disdained my existence, would simply choose to have dinner elsewhere. I was, at this point, the slob that paid the bills and was a hindrance to their joy in life, it seemed. I chuckled to myself as the acne-riddled cashier rang up the cereal, because I knew my wife would nag at me for daring to buy expensive cereal just for myself. As I loaded the groceries into my old Toyota, though, I thought that I heard a voice coming from one of the bags. I shook it off as the long day taking its toll on me, but then I swore that I saw a red glow in my back seat that I just happened to catch for a second in my rearview mirror. I can't explain why, but when I got home, I quickly found the box of cereal, opened and peeled the plastic bag open, started pouring myself a bowl. That's when I heard the little thunk and quickly remembered the promise of a surprise in every box. It too was wrapped in a little plastic baggie, and when I opened it, it kind of startled me. There was that familiar image, the shamrock green attire and top hat, along with the red hair sticking out from underneath that hat, the blank stare in its eyes as it faced forward, and an almost eerie grin that spread across its face in a far too natural way, all in a 5-inch tall figure. The thing creeped me out, if I'm being honest, so I shoved it into the spare kitchen drawer where we kept our batteries. I inadvertently hit the button I never realized was on the back side of the figurine. This caused the eyes to light up and a small recording to repeat, "They're magically delicious," in an Irish accent. I felt more than a little unnerved by the idea that that was supposed to be a children's toy, but I shrugged it off and proceeded to shut the drawer, as I downed not one, but 2 bowls of the marshmallowy goodness that night. After I finished, I headed out of the kitchen upstairs and paused to look towards the box of cereal. Thanks for a trip down memory lane and a nice treat, but I'm afraid your magic can't fix all my problems, before I continued upstairs towards my bedroom. I was only halfway up the stairs when I thought I heard something along the lines of, "Let's test your luck," and a dull red glow casting shadows from the kitchen. I was either extremely tired or I was losing it, so I admittedly jetted up the stairs, feeling a bit creeped out. Usually, I'd stay awake until I heard my family arrive downstairs on nights like this. Then I'd go to sleep. They might hate the sight of me, but I still felt the innate sense of ensuring they were safe. That night, though, I fell almost immediately into one of the deepest sleeps I'd ever experienced, and dreamt all night about things I'd long given up on. In my dreams, I was at a college out east somewhere, top of my class, and a top engineering job already waiting for me when I graduated. I also had a supermodel girlfriend who was pursuing a degree in fashion, and we were planning a weekend away together on the coast when a red glow overcame my dreams and an almost primal-sounding scream jolted me out of sleep. I reached over instinctively to check my wife. She wasn't there, which gave me a slight pause, but she was known to sleep in the spare bedroom when she felt especially annoyed by me. Still, that scream had me on edge, so I bolted out of bed and started down the stairs. That's when I heard the second scream and recognized it immediately as my oldest son. I darted down the stairs as fast as I could, and as I did, my nostrils were assaulted by the most metallic smell that I couldn't place in my state of panic at that moment. I saw a red glow come and go in waves in my descent, and then I swore I heard the sound of the most disgusting type of slurping noise, much like when a 4-year-old eats spaghetti. I ran straight around the corner towards the kitchen, but I slipped immediately on the tiles and slammed the back of my head on the landing. When I tried to get up, I kept slipping and losing my grip from something wet and slimy on the floor. I finally crawled to the light switch by the refrigerator, and when I turned it on, I yelled aloud when I realized the floor was covered in blood. Not just a little bit of blood either, it was literally everywhere in the kitchen. On the table, handprints on the cabinet and fridge, pools of it leading to the living room and onto the carpet. It wasn't just blood either. The viscera reminded me of the summers I spent at the local poultry processing as a teen. There was a piece of, well, something once living everywhere, and I looked in that kitchen along with shreds of clothing that I recognized as belonging to my wife. I started screaming for my family, but received no response. In a panic, I rushed all over the house, but I saw no evidence of any of them anywhere. That is, except for the blood and carnage that the entire house was covered in. I didn't want to believe what I knew the source of all of that was, though. I scrambled to find my cell phone that was tucked away in my jacket on the kitchen chair the night before and dialed 911. Right as I started to dial, though, I saw the red glow again. This time, I realized exactly where it was coming from. Not from the drawer any longer, but right in front of the kitchen table. The light intensified beyond what any reasonable person would believe possible for the figurine. Then I heard a familiar, distorted voice begin to play. "They're magically delicious." It was then that I realized that the grin on its face had dropped into an even deeper arc, and the figurine was absolutely coated in deep, red blood. To my astonishment, I realized now that I was actually seeing its plastic mouth break free of its natural boundaries, and its lips began to move as it repeated itself. "Ahem, I said they were magically delicious." I yelled at him with the most fear and rage a being could ever muster up within themselves, and asked where my family was. "Your wish was my command, my friend. You're free man now, so let's say you and I go find what's at the end of the rainbow, eh? Besides, they truly were magically delicious." I love my older brother, but sometimes I wish he'd died. We were kids. I was only 10 and he was 16. He had just got his driver's license, and we went everywhere in our town because we'd seen so little of it growing up. Every night, Jack would make some excuse to take our family K-car, they don't make them anymore, somewhere, and our parents would always go along with it. They knew we were just excited to explore this new freedom my brother had attained. "Fine, but take Peter with you," my mom said. I could tell Jack was a bit irritated to have to bring me everywhere. I was his luggage, as he and his friends had so affectionately defined me. I could have made an excuse not to go, give him a little space, but I loved my brother. If he was doing something, then it was worth doing, and I couldn't stand to hear about it secondhand. I wanted to be there, sharing his cool experiences with his group of high school friends. I had no friends my own age. I guess I really had no friends. One such friend of Jack's was Kyle, a goofy, intense guy who could never really sit still. He always wanted to pick me up and spin me around. I hated it. Jack made him stop when he noticed how uncomfortable it made me. On what turned out to be our last drive around Bridal Veil Lake, we picked up Kyle. He was waiting on the porch in the rain and looked to be in a pissy mood. His discontent worsened when he saw me riding shotgun. "Jack, really? You brought the kid?" "Get in the back, Pete," Jack said. I crawled between the front seats, and I was happy to be there. I didn't care where I sat. Kyle got in the car and slammed the door behind him. "Drive," he snapped. "What's your problem?" Jack asked as he backed out of the driveway. "Nothing," Kyle said. Didn't really seem like nothing. Parents are being jerks again. I didn't understand then that Kyle's parents were alcoholics, and nasty drunks to boot, and his home life made ours look perfect by comparison. "Sucks, dude. You want to stay at our place tonight?" Kyle didn't answer. He stared out the window. "It's that way." "The nunnery?" "No, the 7-Eleven. Yeah, the effing nunnery. What else?" "You better cool it with the attitude or you can walk," Jack told him. What could Kyle say to that? Jack could kick him out anywhere. Then he'd have a sad walk back home in the rain. I kinda liked that idea. We drove for a while in silence until Kyle finally apologized. "Sorry, man, this was supposed to be fun." "It's no biggie," Jack said. Our dad would say that too, whenever we messed up. "We're going to the nuns?" I asked, as the reliant little K-car crossed the intersection of Ferry Street, where our old house used to be. Neither of them answered the question. The neighborhood, as most know, has the special privilege of being located a few blocks from a psychiatric hospital and a closed-down nunnery. The two institutions used to be associated with each other. Nuns were also nurses during the Korean War, treating vets with PTSD. The nunnery had been vacated since 1970, way before I was born, and while the Catholic Church still owned the land, they seemed to have forgotten about it. Castle-like walls on the ground were torn apart by strands of strangling ivy. Trees that had been cared for became imbalanced and toppled before slowly dying in the mud. The big house, the convent I supposed, where all the nuns used to live, lost its white paint to the elements, and a big crucifix had been dragged from somewhere inside and thrown into the dried-out fountain. This was what I remember of the nunnery before we moved. When we pulled onto the shoulder of the gate, the crucifix hadn't moved in the intervening years. "Right where I left it," Kyle said to himself. I wasn't sure if he meant the crucifix or something else. Maybe I didn't hear him right. The rain had intensified and created a racket on the windshield and the roof. "I didn't bring an umbrella," Jack said. "Buy you a whole raincoat after," Kyle said. "Are you sure it's not stealing?" Jack asked. "How the hell is it stealing? Nobody owns it." Kyle had apparently been visiting the nunnery a few times to pillage items left behind. He'd sold a rug and some silverware to a pawn shop and made a few bucks. But he wasn't the only one with the same idea. On our second expedition, he'd heard some movement on the second floor and gotten freaked out and run away. Any intelligent person would give up at that point and get a job. Kyle thought it better to rope Jack into the scheme. Jack was big, tough, and calmly fierce if the situation called for violence. I'd seen him take down the DeRollo twins during an argument over baseball. They attacked him, so it wasn't wrong that he defended himself with a baseball bat. The twins had ended up in the ER. "They're bound to have some good stuff in the basement," Kyle said, "and the rain's letting up. Let's go." Jack turned to the back seat. "You should stay here, Pete. This won't take long." "What? No way." "I'll lock the door," Jack pleaded. "Just lie down. No one will see you." I shook my head. "No, Jack, I can't. Someone will get me." Kyle chuckled, but Jack shut him up with a glare. "Okay, stay close and be quiet." It felt like a dream. Wet gravel crunched under my sneakers. I stepped in a deep puddle because I had stared up at the dark windows, wondering if anyone or anything was staring back. "Jack," I said, "I'm scared. I don't want to go in." He didn't seem to hear me. Kyle opened the door slowly and turned on his flashlight. The end of the beam showed an empty hallway and a set of stairs leading to the second floor. Kyle went inside. Jack guided me forward and knelt down to say, "Stay in front of me where I can see you, okay? Sorry for bringing you here. I know it seems spooky, but it's just an old building. If there's anyone here, they're probably homeless and just trying to stay warm and dry. They won't bother us." He turned on his flashlight and handed it to me. I felt a little better after the pep talk. It was dark and it smelled like a church mixed with dirt, but that was all. Or so it seemed. In his usual impatient, agitated way, Kyle went ahead, making a ruckus as he opened drawers in an adjacent kitchen and swearing when he found nothing of value. He appeared in the hallway and grasped a doorknob sticking out of the wall I had failed to notice. "This is the basement, but it's locked." As soon as he said locked, the practically seamless door swung open, which was the cause for more swearing. Kyle had been counting on the lock because he thought it meant the basement and its imagined loot were untouched. "No point now," Jack said. He laid a hand on my shoulder and started to turn away. "Whoa, wait, we can at least take a look," Kyle said. Jack hesitated, and I remember distinctly how he gripped my shoulder and crouched slightly to look me in the eye. "What do you think, Pete?" I thought we never should have come here. What I said, however, was that we should take a look. I didn't want to be luggage anymore. Jack giving me the power to choose felt like an opportunity. "Yeah, nice," Kyle said. He gave me a high five and rustled my hair. "Kid's getting cool." It was the nicest thing he'd ever said to me. Jack smirked. "He's always been cool. You're just slow." The chuckle from Kyle was forced. He looked momentarily stung by the barb. I think it was then that I began to realize how important my brother's approval was to Kyle. "Come on," Jack said. "We're wasting time." I opened the door, the nervous energy returning to Kyle. He was like a dog excited for a walk. My flashlight illuminated rough stone steps worn smooth by the passage of 1,000 feet. The walls were similar, though rougher, and there were hooks supporting oil lamps because no electricity had been extended to this part of the building. "Creepy," I said. "Yup," Jack agreed. "Come on." Kyle took the lead again as we descended the cylindrical shaft to a shockingly wide and long corridor. The arches in the ceiling, the floor, the walls were all constructed with red bricks, shedding their mortar. Someday, the weight of the house above would crush the tunnel. I hoped it wasn't today. "What is this place?" Jack asked. Kyle shrugged. "Looks like a dungeon." "Look at I started. The tiny barred window at one of the 6 identical doors I'd been pointing at changed. There had been some movement there, like dirty fingers retracting from a cell. "What is it?" my brother asked. I continued to shine the light at the tiny window, but the sound of a shuffling footstep further along the corridor snatched my attention. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "Nope," Kyle added quickly. He didn't look scared or was working hard to seem like it. There were 3 cell doors, evenly divided on the sides of the corridor. At the farthest end there stood a heavier door, blockaded with boards nailed to the frame. "It's a passage to the hospital," Jack concluded. "The nuns must have done some work here." He didn't add that the work in question was funerary. I found that out later, and far too late. Not that knowing at that moment would have changed the outcome. Like the idiot he was, Kyle went to the big old door at the end and tried to pry the boards away. "What are you doing?" Jack asked. "Probably leads to the hospital." Right, Kyle said. The board ripped off. Water-soaked and termite-infested wood crumbled in his hands. So it isn't in use anymore. Maybe it was used for storage for a while. He didn't say if he meant the nuns or the current hospital staff across the street. Taking things from them would certainly be stealing. And Jack wasn't interested. Hey man, we're not stealing from the hospital. Of course not, Kyle said, too slowly for my liking. I meant the nuns. Maybe the nuns left something. Why would anyone leave something valuable behind a nailed-up door? I asked. Ever hear of buried treasure, Pete? Besides, like you said, we should look. Come on, it's fun. It was gross and dirty. I didn't move and continued to look at the cells flanking our position in the corridor. There were piles of rubbish underneath a moldy workbench near the bottom of the steps. I encouraged us to search there first, but they were too committed to tearing off the planks. That's when I heard the murmur of a prayer. Guys, I said, but they were focused on the door. The voice continued in frantic whispers. Please, beg you, Michael, do not abandon me. I thought someone was in one of the cells and that they might be afraid of us. If I were homeless, I'd probably stay in an abandoned place and be afraid all the time about somebody wanting to hurt me, too. It's okay, I said, still unsure where the scared voice had come from. We're not out to hurt anybody. Kyle pulled the last plank off the door at that very moment. Guys, I tried again, but they were talking about what to do next. The door still wouldn't open. Kyle wanted to kick it down. Jack thought they should think about it first. Here, come here, the voice said quietly, and this time I knew which cell it came from. Hello? I'm in here, it sounded like a man whispering. Help me, I'm here. Please come. Guys, I said loudly, and unfortunately at the same time, Kyle started laying his boot onto the passageway door. I moved closer to Jack, and we exchanged a look. He was sweaty and afraid. There's somebody in that cell, I told him. What? He didn't understand. Kyle's boot plunged through the rotten door. Immediately, a current of smelly air was freed to caress our faces and our bodies. There's somebody... Jack reached for Kyle too late. His dumb friend rammed his body into the remnants of the door, and instead of stopping him, Jack tripped and fell on top of him. That's why I was the only one to see. Ahead, a gently curving ramp ascended, and against a painted wall came the shadows of what I can only describe as a king. His silhouette wore a tall and ornately evil crown, and he laughed as the shadows of several leashed dogs tugged him down the ramp. The shadows, however, were all that appeared. Nobody came down that ramp, only the laughter and the heavy breathing of the dogs. Jack scrambled backwards off his friend, and Kyle crawled out of the tunnel doorway. There was nothing to be seen there, yet I knew. They did too, despite their eventual denials. Something evil lurked ahead, and it had seen us. Leashes slapped the floor as if dropped, and padded feet and claws scrambled for purchase on the smooth concrete. The dogs had been let go. It sounded like it, the tunnel still appearing empty. Run! A female voice shouted from one of the cells. Run! Run! Her screams rang in my ear. I didn't know who ran first or how I ended up at the door at the top of the basement stairs. When my hands couldn't turn the knob, my legs gave out. The invisible horror pursued us. Jack raged against the basement exit. Strong arms wrapped around my wrist and lifted me and turned. Kyle was screaming in my ear. Jack! I called. He turned around and saw that Kyle had picked me up as a human shield. Jack! I pleaded. He just watched as Kyle threw me at the growls as they climbed the stairs. I hit the landing and felt their teeth sink into my flesh. The animals tore away my skin and feasted on my muscles. I was still alive when they pierced my stomach. When would I die? The pain made me wish for death. Torrid screaming from below, from the cells, suddenly faded. The ordeal was ending. Only one pained howl remained. Mine. Pete! 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 Jack said over and over. The basement doorway was open now, and Kyle walked through it. Jack picked up whatever was left of me and placed what had to be my mangled corpse in the back seat. "Dad, we'll be mad about the blood," I said. Confusion entered Jack's concern. "What blood, Pete? There's no blood. You're fine." He went to the driver's seat and started the car. Kyle wouldn't look at us. "Sorry," he said before exiting the car at his house. "Sorry, Pete. I'm sorry you fell. Tried to catch you." It was a lie. I didn't have the will to deny it, though. By the time we got home, I realized there really wasn't any blood or physical injuries at all. I got out of the car and followed Jack inside. Our parents were watching TV in the living room while we ate Neapolitan ice cream in the kitchen. It seemed very normal until Jack put me in bed and stretched out in his. We shared a room. "You okay, Pete?" "Yeah," I lied. "But what happened there?" He stared at the ceiling. "I don't know." That was the last we spoke of the nunnery. Jack stopped driving for fun. I stopped hanging out with him. I didn't see Kyle again until a decade later. I was waiting for an order at a burger place, and a completely hairless man walked in. I didn't recognize him as Kyle until I was on my way home. I don't know why he lost all his hair, and I didn't care. My brother and I grew apart pretty fast. He hadn't tried to stop Kyle. None of us should have broken into the nunnery. I never forgot the feeling of being torn apart by those dogs. I'd only seen their shadows cast on the walls of the tunnel in my waking life. In my nightmares, they were huge mutts with bloodied maws. The Dark King remained a shadow in both worlds, revealing nothing more of himself but cruel laughter on the wrong side of midnight. I try so hard to sleep, but it's not much better to meet him in my dreams. It might be worse. Jack had been in university a few years by the time I reached high school and gained access to drugs and alcohol. While his life took off into careers and family and prosperity, mine declined. I never finished high school, became addicted, and struggled to make a connection with anyone. Eventually, my parents and Jack ceased contact altogether. I'm alone, but never truly alone. His shadow follows. Sometimes I can smell his dogs. Nothing short of total substance-based annihilation of my mind provides temporary reprieve. I tried therapy, but the experts call my experience a delusion and put me on strong antipsychotic meds that don't work. I went to a priest, but he kicked me out and said I should see a doctor. Rehab didn't work, obviously. So I'm writing to all of you. Maybe you can help. At least, if you care enough to have read this far. The nunnery isn't hard to find. I think I have to go back. Most of whatever I am is still there. The dogs want to rest. The king is indifferent, so long as I suffer. I'm tired. There's comfort in giving in and giving up. I'll be waiting in one of the cells with the others. They know. They understand. I hate you, Jack. I miss my brother. I've always been passionate about exploring caves and tombs, particularly those that are uncharted and mysterious. The thrill of venturing into these deep, dark spaces where few dare to tread is something that never fails to excite me. Even when faced with the most perilous and deadly caves, I remain undeterred by the danger, embracing the adrenaline rush to the fullest. Despite being well equipped and prepared for an expedition, there were moments where I feared for my life and believed that my time might be up. I even left farewell messages on my phone for my family, knowing that I had no children to worry about leaving behind as a father and no teammates to slow me down on this solo cave exploration. Today, I stumbled across the most thrilling tomb I've ever encountered. It remains unexplored by anyone else, so I'm eager to be the first to explore and document the incredible findings awaiting within. I spent 3 months getting ready for my next dive, feeling both excited and nervous about what I might find. In a remote area of the earth, I stumbled upon something hidden deep underground, within a cave system, far away from civilization. This cave was unique, with a vertical and damp structure that required the use of ropes for navigation. As I descended down the shaft, I came across the entrance to the tomb, adorned with what looked like an image of a mysterious religious figure, covered in robes and being carried to an unknown destination. The rest of the decorations were obscured by dust, and it was only during my second dive that I noticed them. Lucky for me, I had my phone to capture photos of the decorations, for mapping purposes, before proceeding any further. Additionally, I had a torch and a spare flashlight, with various gear to illuminate my path as I went deeper into the darkness. As I descended the stairs, I observed the walls and brick structures, unsure which historical era that brick reminded me of. Upon entering the initial room, I noticed dusty murals adorned the walls, alongside empty torches, with the murals written in ancient Latin, a language I'd studied during my adventures in exploring. The initial mural displayed the following message: "This is not a place where riches or devotion can be found, but a prison filled with the specter of death. Retreat now, or face an endless torment." The text sent chills running down my back. It was unlike any tomb I had ever been in before, but my curiosity pushed me to delve deeper. I snapped a few pics and studied the second mural. The message on the second one was written like this: "This prison that we have built is meant to be untouched and undisturbed. It should be left behind, forgotten forever. May God protect us from him." I found myself pondering, may God protect us from him. It was evident that this location did not appreciate intrusion. Despite contemplating a retreat, the rush of adrenaline I experienced was unlike anything I had felt before. Against my better instincts, I decided to press on. The mural room opened up to a staircase that descended even further, prompting me to ponder just how far down it went. The sound of my footsteps reverberated through the empty staircase, indicating that the descent went on for quite a distance. Eventually, the stairs came to an end, revealing a massive room adorned with various artworks. "This find is the most incredible find of the era," I said out loud. The walls of the room were adorned with artwork, expanding upward and upward for a minimum of 30 meters. One particular detail caught my eye. Could these artistic walls be serving as a guidance or direction? Possibly for individuals like me who had overlooked the murals and continued exploring anyway. The main focus of the artwork was on a gathering of individuals dressed in unfamiliar attire, worshipping an altar emanating a dark gas that contained eerie faces showing a range of emotions from delight to fear. I noticed and observed the man laying on the altar, black gas escaping from his chest. Despite his efforts to contain the cloud with his hands, it was unsuccessful. As I was busy capturing multiple photos of the artwork from different angles, I suddenly heard a low growl emanating from several directions. I heard the sound of large stones rumbling, which indicated to me that it was time to quickly make a retreat. Having captured photographs and explored to a satisfying extent, I planned on returning at a later time. Unfortunately, while I was rushing up the stairs, I narrowly escaped death when a massive rock almost hit me in the head. I quickly ran back down the stairs when the way ahead to the entrance was completely blocked by an enormous boulder. It was a dreadful situation, far worse than any cave mishap I had encountered before. There seemed to be no escape, and my mind immediately turned to thoughts of my family, my friends, my past cave expeditions. Surprisingly, I found myself thinking about exploring again. Despite feeling scared and vulnerable, I realized I should have been better prepared with the right gear. By then, it was already too late, though. It was as if the cave was beckoning me further in, though, enticing me to continue exploring. I was trying to go home, but I realized I was unable to leave. The tomb had summoned me, and I had no choice but to go on. As I made my way to the art room, I wished and hoped for a different way out, when all of a sudden my torch died, enveloping me in total darkness, causing me to trip and scatter the contents of my bag everywhere. As my hands groped for my spare flashlight, I was startled by the sound of singing emanating from the shadows, singing a language that seemed unearthly and ancient to me. In a state of panic, I unintentionally kicked various objects into the darkness, including my flashlight, which I inadvertently switched on. Frantically searching for the flashlight, I began to see faces emerging from the shadows. The volume of singing increased. The faces in the shadows began to smile at me. But as soon as I switched on the flashlight, everything came to an abrupt halt. My heart was racing uncontrollably. I needed to pause and collect myself for a moment, and after gathering my gear, I proceeded to venture deeper into the tomb. As I'd injured my leg by accidentally kicking my gear, I was unable to run and had to take slower steps while passing through the next chamber. There was a lot of artwork that caught my attention, and I quickly snapped photos to study later. One piece in particular depicted the man from earlier on the altar, standing amidst the eerie black smoke and terrifying faces. Another showed the figures from earlier paintings, lifeless, engulfed in the black smoke seeping into their wounds. Besides this room, there was another chamber where sculptures of deceased individuals with horrifying expressions were positioned, all of them appearing to bow down to the man wearing a crown made out of human skin on the altar. I didn't even think about capturing this moment on my phone. I was more focused on finding the exit. Another set of stairs descended further into the darkness, my legs refusing to move. I was consumed by terror, a sensation of an otherworldly presence emanating from below, followed by the resumption of eerie singing, which spurred me to glance backwards, only to find nothing in sight. Out of nowhere, my legs collapsed, causing me to tumble down the stairs, leaving me covered in bruises and injuries, and I had no strength to stand back up. What I witnessed came close to stealing everything I had. I found myself in the grand altar room, which was adorned with towering pillars and statues of deceased individuals. The torches cast a dim light, despite the flames burning black. Sunlight was pouring through the broken gap in the wall of the room, providing me with a potential escape route. In my frantic rush to depart, I overlooked or possibly ignored the figure lying on the altar. The individual depicted in the paintings and the artwork appeared in a distorted position with dark gas enveloping his mouth and chest, giving him a zombified and paralyzed appearance that deviated from his usual depiction. Stupidly, I began moving on my hands towards the sunlight, because my legs were frozen. Upon awakening, the corpse-like man's lifeless fingers began to move, while dark gas slowly escaped from his mouth. I screamed and hurriedly crawled towards the opening, making sure to keep my phone in my pocket while abandoning the bag and my flashlight to lessen the burden, relying solely on the lights of the torches and the sunlight to guide me. I turned around and saw the man standing there, with frothy gas coming out of his mouth. Inside him, there were more faces that seemed to be singing a melodious tune, urging me not to leave. I made a conscious effort to ignore them. Out of nowhere, the man began running towards me at an incomprehensible pace, with dark fog foaming out of his mouth and revealing sinister faces, embodying pure evil. He jumped at me and seized my legs, dragging me towards the altar. I kicked and kicked with all my might, with my now unparalyzed legs, but my efforts were in vain. Desperately, I clawed at the loose dirt, yearning for the sun. The man exerted more force, causing several bones in my leg to break completely. I yelled until my voice was hoarse, yet I managed to hold firm to the ground. I was on the brink of freedom, yet it was so far when I chose to kick once more, this time connecting with his deteriorating face, causing him to release his grip on me. With my fingers outstretched, I took one last attempt to reach the warm sunlight, but I fell short of escaping through the hole. The man from the altar attempted to jump towards me again, but he inadvertently came in contact with the sunlight, causing him to recoil. I witnessed his body beginning to disintegrate as soon as the sun's rays made contact. I saw an opportunity and quickly seized it as my fingers clutched onto the damaged stonework. I jumped outside through the hole, which revealed a staircase going up. As a large stone door started to close slowly behind me, I turned around and observed the man still melting, emanating black smoke from newly formed holes. He melted into a liquid, a dark vapor within him starting to vanish upon contact with the sun. It seemed as though a divine intervention had rescued me from the terrifying entity. After I managed to emerge from the stairway, I found myself surrounded by dense woods, yet I could make out a village not too far away. I wondered how far the tomb had transported me. Despite having only 6% battery life left and being stranded, I was fortunate enough to still have service. I managed to drag myself to the nearby village where I was able to call an ambulance, though it was a painful journey. Unfortunately, I suffered irreparable damage to my leg, leaving me disabled for the rest of my life. However, the important thing was that I survived. I no longer felt the desire to explore caves or engage in thrilling activities. Seemed like a piece of my soul was lost that day, resting in the tomb alongside the eerie gas and the altar man's dark intentions. If you come across that tomb in the future, do yourself a favor and leave it alone. There is no hidden treasure or religious significance to be found there. It's a prison that should be left undisturbed for all eternity. The gentle sway of the train car had always been soothing to me. As a regional sales manager for a large pharmaceutical company, I spent more time on the railway than I did in my own bed. The rhythmic clack of the wheels on the tracks was my lullaby. The ever-changing landscape outside my window, a constant companion. This particular Tuesday evening found me on yet another overnight train, heading from Chicago to New York for a critical meeting. I settled into my usual routine, laptop out, spreadsheet open, cup of mediocre coffee cooling on the fold-down tray. The first sign that something was amiss came about 3 hours into the journey. I glanced at my watch, frowning slightly. We should have reached Cleveland by now, but the cityscape outside remained stubbornly rural. Fields and forests rolled by, bathed in the eerie glow of a full moon. I flagged down a passing attendant, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a pinched expression. "Excuse me, but shouldn't we have reached Cleveland by now?" She gave me a strange look, her eyes slightly unfocused. "Cleveland? I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not familiar with that stop. Perhaps you're thinking of a different route." Before I could respond, she hurried away, disappearing into the next car. I sat back, puzzled. How could she not know Cleveland? It was a major stop on this line. I shook my head, chalking it up to a new employee, and returned to my work. As the hours ticked by, my unease grew. The landscape outside never changed, an endless loop of moonlit fields and shadowy forests. My phone had lost signal a long time ago, and my watch seemed to be malfunctioning, its hands spinning wildly before stopping altogether. I decided to stretch my legs, hoping a walk through the train might clear my head. As I made my way through the cars, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. The few passengers I saw sat motionless in their seats, staring blankly ahead or out the window. In the dining car, I found an elderly man hunched over a cup of coffee. His wrinkled hands trembled slightly as he lifted the mug to his lips. "Excuse me," I said, sliding into the seat beside him. "I don't mean to bother you, but have you noticed anything strange about this journey?" The old man's rheumy eyes focused on me, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. "You're new here, aren't you?" he said, his voice a dry whisper. "First time on this line." I nodded, a chill running down my spine. "What do you mean, this line? This is just the regular Chicago to New York route, isn't it?" He let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a cough. "Oh, my boy, this ain't no regular route. This here's the last line. Ain't no New York we're heading for." "I don't understand," I said, my heart beginning to race. "Where are we going, then?" The old man leaned in closer, the smell of stale coffee on his breath. "Nowhere," he whispered. "Everywhere. This train don't stop, son. It just keeps on going, round and round, a world without end." I jerked back, convinced I was dealing with a madman. "That's impossible. Every train has to stop eventually." He just smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "You go on believing that if it makes you feel better, but mark my words, you'll see. We all figure it out, sooner or later." I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. "You're crazy. This is just a normal train. We'll be in New York by morning." As I turned to go, the old man called out, "What's your name, son?" I hesitated for a moment. Jack Thurston." "Well, Jack Thurston, I'm Howard. I'll be seeing you around. We got all the time in the world, after all." I hurried back to my seat, Howard's words echoing in my mind. It was nonsense, of course. Trains don't go on forever. There had to be a rational explanation for the delay and the strange behavior of the staff. As I sank into my seat, I noticed a young woman across the aisle, furiously scribbling in a notebook. Her long dark hair fell in a curtain around her face, and her legs bounced with nervous energy. "Excuse me," I said, leaning towards her. "I don't suppose you know when we're due to arrive in New York, do you?" She looked up, her eyes wide and slightly manic. "New York?" she repeated, letting out a hysterical little giggle. "Oh, honey, there is no New York, not anymore. There's only the train." I felt my blood run cold. What are you talking about?" She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been on this train for I don't know how long. Days, weeks, it all blurs together. But I've figured it out. We're not going anywhere. We're stuck in a loop, a never-ending journey to nowhere." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's impossible. You're just confused. Maybe you fell asleep and missed your stop." She laughed again, a sound devoid of humor. Oh, I wish it were that simple. But look around you. Have you seen anyone get off? Have we stopped at any stations? This isn't a normal train, Jack. This is something else entirely." I started at the sound of my name. "How do you know my name?" She smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "I heard you talking to old Howard in the dining car. I'm Lisa, by the way. Welcome aboard the Eternal Express." I stood up abruptly, my head spinning. "This is crazy. All of you are insane. I'm going to go find the conductor and get some answers." As I stormed off towards the front of the train, I heard Lisa call out behind me, "Good luck. Don't say I didn't warn you." I made my way through the cars, each one identical to the last. The same faded blue seats, the same flickering overhead lights, the same black-faced passengers staring into nothingness. How long had I been walking? It felt like hours, but that was impossible in a train of normal length. Finally, I reached what should have been the engine car. Instead of a locomotive, I found myself in another passenger car, exactly like all the others. I spun around, disoriented. How could this be? A hand on my shoulder made me jump. I turned to find the attendant from earlier, her pinched face now twisted into an unnaturally wide smile. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice sickly sweet. "I need to speak with a conductor," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. There's been some kind of mistake. This train should have reached New York by now." She smiled, and it never wavered. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no conductor. There's no mistake either. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." I backed away from her, my heart pounding. "What is this place? What's happening?" She tilted her head, her eyes suddenly black and empty. "This is the last line, Mr. Thurston. The train that never stops, never ends. You bought a ticket, and now you're on the ride of eternity." I turned and ran, pushed past confused passengers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but reality. I burst into the space between cars, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The door to the next car was just a few feet away. If I could reach it, maybe I could find a way out of this nightmare train. But as I stepped forward, the gap between the cars began to stretch. The next door moved further and further away, no matter how far I ran. The wind howled around me, drowning out my screams of infuriation and fear. Suddenly a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back into the car. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Lisa stood over me, her face pale in the flickering light. "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "You can't go out there. Between the cars, that's where it gets you." "Where what gets you?" I asked, my voice shaking. She helped me to my feet, glancing nervously at the door. "The thing that runs the train. The thing that brought us all here. Trust me, you don't want to meet it." As if on cue, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the car. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Part machine, part animal. All wrong. The lights flickered more intently. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something massive moving in the shadow between the cars. Lisa pulled me back to my seat, her grip on my arm almost painful. Listen to me," she said urgently. "I know this is hard to accept. God knows I fought against it for I don't even know how long. But fighting only makes it worse. You have to accept where you are, or you'll go mad." I slumped in my seat, my mind reeling. "But why? Why is this happening? What is this place?" She shook her head. "I don't know. None of us do. All we know is that we're here on this never-ending journey. Some think it's hell, others purgatory. Old Howard thinks it's some kind of cosmic mistake. Me, I think it's just the universe's way of saying, 'Tough luck, kiddo.'" I looked out the window, watching the same moonlit landscape roll by. How many times had I seen those same fields, those same trees? How long would I continue to see them? "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Lisa gave me a sad smile. "We ride. We talk. We try to stay sane. We hope that maybe, just maybe, one day we'll reach the last stop." As the train rolled on into the endless night, I realized with a sinking heart that my journey had only just begun. The destination, that remained a terrifying mystery. Days blended into nights and nights into days. The monotonous rhythm of the train became the backdrop to my existence. I lost count of how many times I'd watched the same scenery roll by. How many times I'd walked the length of the train, hoping to find something, anything different. Lisa became my anchor in this sea of madness. She spent hours talking, sharing stories of our lives before the train. She had been a journalist, always chasing the next big story. "Guess I found it," she would say with a bitter laugh, gesturing at our surroundings. Old Howard joined us often, his weathered face a map of time he'd spent on this hellish journey. "Been riding this train for longer than I can remember," he'd say, his roomy old eyes distant. "Seen folks come and go. Some just disappear. Others, well," he'd trail off, shaking his head. I learned to fear the space between the cars. Sometimes, late at night, when the train's rhythm seemed to falter, we'd hear things, scraping, slithering sounds. Once I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark undulating past the windows. Lisa pulled me away before I could get a good look. "Trust me, you don't want to know." The other passengers were a mix of resigned and the mad. Like us, they tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Others had given in to despair, sitting in the same spot day after day, staring blankly at nothing. Then there were those who'd lost their minds entirely, prowling the cars with wild eyes and incoherent ramblings. One such soul was called Preacher, tall and menacing, with a tangled beard and eyes that burned with fanatical fervor. He would roam the train, shouting about sins and redemption. "We're all here for a reason," he'd bellow, spittle flying from his lips. "This is our punishment, our penance, I say penance. Repent, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find your way off this damn train." Most ignored him, but some listened. I watched as he gathered a small following, passengers desperate for any explanation, any hope of escape. It was on what I guessed to be my 100th day on the train that things took a darker turn. I was jolted awake by screams coming from the front of the car. Lisa was already on her feet, her face a mask of terror. "They've done it," she whispered. "They've actually done it." I followed her gaze to see a group of the preacher's followers dragging a struggling passenger towards the door between the cars. The preacher stood by, his arms raised, chanting something I couldn't make out over the victim's screams. "What are you doing?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "A sacrifice," old Howard said, his voice grim. "Fools think they can appease whatever's running the train, buy their way off with blood." I started to move towards them, but Lisa held me back. "Don't. There's nothing we can do. Just don't watch." But I couldn't look away. The group reached the door, and with a final triumphant cry from the preacher, they shoved their victim out into the space between cars. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a sound, a wet, tearing sound that would haunt my nightmares for days to come. The door slammed shut, cutting off the screams. The preacher turned his face to the rest of us, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's done. The unworthy has been cast out. Soon we shall reach our final destination." But the train rolled on, unchanged. Hours passed, then days. No final stop, no salvation. Just the endless journey and the growing madness of the preacher and his flock. More sacrifices followed. The train's population dwindled as passenger after passenger was thrown to whatever lurked below the cars. Those of us who refused to join the preacher's cult banded together, watching each other's backs, sleeping in shifts. It was during one of my watch shifts that I first saw her. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, wandering alone through the car. Her pink dress was pristine, her blonde hair neatly braided. She looked so out of place in this nightmare that for a moment I thought she was a hallucination. "Hello," I said softly, not wanting to scare her. "Are you lost?" She turned to me, and I had to stifle a gasp. Her eyes were completely black, like empty voids in her small face. When she spoke, her voice was old, ancient even. "Lost," she repeated. "No, I don't think so. I know exactly where I am. Do you?" "What are you?" I whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little bit too sharp. "I'm a passenger like you. We're all passengers here, Jack. All of us, riding the rails to eternity." "How do you know my name?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "I know everyone's name," she said, her black eyes boring into mine. "I know why you're here. I know their sins, their fears, their deepest, darkest secrets. Would you like to know yours, Jack?" I backed away, my heart pounding. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Jack, you can't run from me. You can't run from any of this. You bought your ticket. Now you have to ride." I blinked and she was gone. Just vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. I slumped in my seat, my mind reeling. Was I lost? Had I finally snapped, like so many others in this godforsaken train? I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, Lisa was shaking me awake. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Jack, something happened. The train, it's slowing down." I sat up, suddenly alert. She was right. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could feel the train deaccelerating. The familiar clack of wheels on tracks was slowing, becoming more distinct. Passengers were stirring, looking around in confusion and hope. Even the preacher and his followers had stopped their mad ranting, staring out the windows with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Are we stopping?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Old Howard shook his head, his expression grim. "Don't get your hopes up, son. In all my time here, I've never known this train to stop. Whatever's happening, it ain't gonna be good." As if to punctuate his words, the lights in the car began to flicker more intensely than I'd ever seen them. The temperature dropped rapidly, our breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. Then, with a great screeching of metal on metal, the train ground to a halt. For a moment there was absolute silence. We all held our breath, waiting, hoping, fearing. Then with a hiss of hydraulics, the doors slid open. "Finally," the preacher cried, pushing his way towards the exit. "Our salvation is at hand. Come, brothers and sisters, let us—" His words were cut off by a scream of pure terror. As he stepped off the train, something grabbed him, something huge and dark and impossible. In the blink of an eye, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but a spreading pool of blood on the platform. Chaos erupted. Passengers pushed and shoved, some trying to get off the train, others desperately attempting to close the doors. I lost sight of Lisa in the pandemonium. And through it all, I heard laughter, the same glass-like sound from beyond. I turned to see the little girl with the black eyes, standing calmly in the middle of the mayhem. "Welcome to the last stop, Jack," she said, her voice cutting through the screams and cries. "Are you ready to get off?" As I stared into those bottomless black pits, I realized, with dawning horror, that our endless journey had only just begun. The real nightmare was only starting. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a train whistle, signaling the departure to our next unknown destination. The chaos around me faded into a dull roar, and I stared into the little girl's black eyes. Time seemed to slow. In that moment, I had a sudden, crystal-clear realization. This was a test. The endless train ride, the maddening repetition, the horror I'd witnessed. It had all been leading to this moment of choice. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "No, I'm not getting off. Not here. Not like this." The little girl's smile faltered for a split second, a crack in her otherworldly composure. "You don't have a choice, Jack. Everyone has to get off eventually." I stood my ground, even as I heard more screams from the platform, more passengers being dragged into the darkness. There's always a choice. Told me I bought a ticket to ride. Well, I'm not ready for it to end. Her eyes narrowed. "You can't stay on the train forever, Jack. Doesn't work like that." "Watch me," I growled, turning away from her and pushing through the panicked crowd. I had to find Lisa. I had to find Howard. We'd survived this long together. I wasn't about to leave them behind. I spotted Howard first, huddled in a corner, his eyes wide with terror. "Come on, we need to move," I said, grabbing his arm. "Where? There's nowhere to go. It's got us. It's finally got us." I shook him, perhaps more roughly than I intended. "Listen to me. This isn't the end. It's only just another part of the journey. We have to stick together. We need to find Lisa." Something in my voice must have reached him, because he nodded and stumbled to his feet. We pushed through the crowd, searching desperately for Lisa's familiar face. We found her near the front of the car, trying to pull other passengers back from the door. "Lisa, we have to go," I called out. She turned, relief flooding her face when she saw me. "Go where? In case you haven't noticed, we're a little short on options here." I pointed towards the back of the train. "We keep going. This thing has to end somewhere, and I don't think it's here." As if in response to my words, I heard the train whistle again, louder this time. The engine was starting up. "It's leaving. We have to get off now," Howard said, his eyes wide. "Or we'll be trapped forever," I finished for him. "I got news for you, Howard. We're already trapped. Have been since we first stepped on board. But now we've got a chance to find the real way out." Lisa looked at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You think this is all part of it, don't you? The final test?" "It has to be, and I'm not failing it by giving in now." The train lurched, beginning to move. Around us, the last of the passengers were either fleeing onto the platform or collapsing in despair. "It's now or never," I said. "Are you with me?" Lisa grabbed my hand without hesitation. Howard hesitated for a moment, looking longingly at the door, but then took Lisa's other hand. "Right. Let's see where this crazy train takes us." As the train picked up speed, we made our way towards the back, pushing against the tide of terrified passengers. The little girl appeared again, her face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. You have to get off. Everyone gets off." "Not today," I told her, pushing past. We reached the final car, just as the platform disappeared from view. Through the windows, we could see only darkness, not the familiar darkness of night, but an absolute void, empty of all light and substance. The train picked up speed, rattling and shaking more violently than ever before. We huddled together, bracing ourselves against the walls of the car. "What now?" Lisa yelled. "We wait, and we don't let go." The darkness outside seemed to press in on us, seeping through the windows like a living thing. The lights in the car flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I could feel Lisa's hand in mine, Howard's presence at my side, but I couldn't see them. Then, just as suddenly as it had began, the shaking stopped. The oppressive darkness lifted, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, and the train began to slow. Sunlight, real, warm, beautiful sunlight, streamed through the windows. I blinked my eyes, unused to the brightness after so long in the train's artificial light. As my vision cleared, I saw that we were pulling into a station, a real station, with people waiting on the platform, going about their daily lives as if nothing was amiss. The train came to a gentle stop. The doors opened with a familiar hiss. For a moment, none of us moved, afraid that this was just another trick, another test. Then Howard let out a whoop of joy and rushed for the door. Lisa and I followed, stepping out onto the platform with shaky legs. The station read, Grand Central Station. We'd made it. We were in New York. As we stood there, breathless and disbelieving, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I turned to see the little girl with the black eyes, but now in the sunlight she looked different, normal, just like a regular kid with brown eyes and a confused expression. "Excuse me, is this the train to Chicago?" I knelt down to her level, smiling. "No, sweetheart, this train just came from Chicago, but trust me, you don't want to get on it." She nodded, thanking me, and ran off to find her parents. I watched her go, a weight lifting from my chest. Lisa squeezed my hand. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, then at Howard, then at the bustling station around us. "Yeah, I think it is," I said, finally allowing myself to believe. As we made our way out of the station and into the bright New York morning, I knew that the memories of our endless journey would stay with us forever. But we had faced the darkness, made our choices, found our way back to the light. And if I ever saw a train again, it'd be too soon. I've borne witness to horrors beyond mortal comprehension. My companions and I, seekers of truth hidden in the shadows, have traversed the globe in pursuit of spectral phenomenon. Yet nothing could have prepared us for the eldritch terrors that awaited us on the blood-soaked soil of a long-forgotten American battlefield. Our small band of ghost hunters consisted of 4 souls bound by an insatiable curiosity for the supernatural. There was myself, descended from a long line of Bavarian mystics, Hans Mueller, a skeptical physicist whose rational mind had been shaken by an encounter with a poltergeist in his youth, Greta Werber, an expert on occult history whose family had guarded arcane secrets for generations, and Klaus Bayer, a former priest whose crisis of faith had led him to seek answers in the realm of spirit. We had come to this desolate corner of Virginia at the behest of a local historian who had reported strange occurrences on the site of a Civil War skirmish. Locals spoke in hushed tones of unearthly sounds echoing across the mist-shrouded fields at night, of phantom soldiers seen marching in formation, of an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into one's very bones. As our rented vehicle bounced along the rutted road leading to the site, I felt a growing sense of unease. The lush green countryside seemed to darken with every passing mile, the very air growing thick and oppressive. Hans even rationalized, attempting to lighten the mood with jokes about American ghost stories, but his laughter rang hollow in the unnatural stillness. We arrived at the designated coordinates just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields before us. An old, dilapidated farmhouse stood on the edge of the property, its windows dark and foreboding. As we unloaded our equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, other tools of the trade, I noticed that Greta had gone very pale. "There's something wrong here," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously across the landscape. "Can't you feel it? It's as if the very ground is hungry." Klaus laid a comforting hand on her shoulder, but I could see the concern etched on his weathered face. "We've faced dark forces before, mein Freund. Whatever lurks here, we shall face it together." As twilight deepened into true night, we began our investigation. Hans and Greta took readings near the old farmhouse, while Klaus and I ventured into the field proper. The tall grass whispered against our legs as we moved, and more than once I could have sworn I heard muffled sounds of gunfire. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, though the air was eerie still, or perhaps some local teens playing pranks. Klaus shook his head grimly. "This is no prank, Wilhelm. There's an awareness here. Can't you sense it? It's as if 1,000 eyes are watching our every move." I was about to respond when my foot struck something solid in the grass. Kneeling down, I brushed away the vegetation to reveal a rusted piece of metal. As I lifted it, my blood ran cold. It was a belt buckle, corroded by time, but still bearing the unmistakable insignia of a Confederate soldier. "Klaus," I called, my voice trembling. "I think we've found—" My words were cut short by a piercing scream from the direction of the farmhouse. We sprinted back, our hearts pounding, to find Hans supporting a shaking Greta, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "The basement! I saw! God, I saw!" Before she could finish, a low, rumbling sound began to emanate from beneath our feet. The ground itself seemed to tremble, and a foul, rotten stench filled the air. From the shadowy doorway of the farmhouse, a sickly green light began to pulse, growing brighter with each passing second. "We need to leave," Hans said urgently, already beginning to guide Greta towards the vehicle. "Whatever this is, it's beyond our expertise. We need to call in reinforcements. Maybe even—" His words were drowned out by a deafening roar as the green light exploded outward, engulfing us all in a sticky glow. I felt a sensation of falling, being pulled downward by unseen hands, and then darkness, absolute and all-encompassing. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying face down in cold, damp earth. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Slowly, I raised my head, blinking to clear my vision. What I saw defied all rational explanation. Gone was the overgrown field and the dilapidated farmhouse. Instead, I found myself in the midst of a raging battle. Union and Confederate soldiers clashed all around me, their uniforms pristine, their faces set in grim determination. Yet, there was something profoundly wrong with the scene. The soldiers moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms seeming to shimmer and distort at the edges. Their eyes, dear God, their eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to draw in all light. I scrambled to my feet, desperately searching for my companions. "Hans! Greta! Klaus!" I shouted, my voice lost in the cacophony of battle. Just as I turned, I realized with mounting horror that the fighting seemed to be focused on a central point, a swirling vortex of that same sickly green energy we had seen in the farmhouse. And at its edge stood a figure that I could only describe as an abomination. It towered over the phantom soldiers, its form a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, constantly shifting and reforming. Where its head should have been, a pulsing orb of that verdant light throbbed in time with the vortex. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, I saw it reach out with its pseudopod and grasp one of the spectral combatants. The soldier's form seemed to dissolve, drawn into the creature as it let out a sound that was part scream and part laugh. "Wilhelm!" A hand grasped my shoulder, and I whirled to find Klaus standing behind me, his face pale but determined. "We have to find the others and get out of here." I nodded numbly, allowing him to guide me through the chaos of the battlefield. The phantom soldiers paid us no heed, locked in their eternal struggle as we moved. I began to notice other anomalies, patches of the modern world, bleeding through the Civil War tableau. Here, a cluster of our scientific instruments lay scattered in the mud. There, a piece of the old farmhouse wall stood incongruously amidst a grove of trees that looked centuries old. "What's happening?" I shouted to Klaus, as we ducked to avoid a volley of musket fire that passed harmlessly through our bodies. "Have we gone mad?" "I fear it's worse than that. I believe we've stumbled into a tear in the fabric of reality. This place, it's a nexus point where multiple timelines are converging. That thing at the center, it's feeding on chaos, growing stronger with each soul it consumes." Before I could process this terrifying information, we heard a familiar voice calling out, "Over here, quickly!" We turned to see Hans waving frantically from the shelter of a crumbling stone wall. As we approached, I saw Greta huddled beside him, her eyes wide and unfocused. "She's in shock," he explained as we crouched beside him. "I found her wandering in a daze near that thing. Wilhelm, Klaus, what is happening? In God's name, what is going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat as I saw the expression of abject horror that dawned on Hans's face. Following his gaze, I turned to see the battlefield had fallen silent. The phantom soldiers stood motionless, their empty eyes all turned in our direction. Beyond them, towering and terrible, was the abomination. He began to move towards us. Each step it took seemed to distort the very air around us. Reality rippled and warped, images from different eras bleeding into one another. I saw glimpses of the field as it must have looked during the Civil War, flashes of the overgrown present that we had just encountered, and terrifying visions of a blasted, lifeless future. "We have to do something," Klaus said, his voice steady despite the fear that he must be feeling. "We can't let that thing break through to our world." Greta stirred then, her eyes focusing for the first time since we'd found her. "The vortex. It's a wound in time. If we can close it..." Hans shook his head. "With what? We're not equipped to deal with anything like this." As the others argued, I found my gaze drawn to the belt buckle I had discovered. It still lay clutched in my hand, forgotten in the chaos. As I stared at it, a wild, desperate idea began to form. "Our equipment," I said suddenly, cutting through the debate. "Hans, you said it was scattered across the battlefield, yes? If we can gather it, maybe we can use it to disrupt the energy field surrounding that thing." Klaus caught on immediately. "Yes, and if we can weaken it, perhaps we can push it through the vortex before it fully manifests in our reality." It was a long shot, but it was the only plan we had. As the abomination drew ever closer, we split up to gather what we could from our ghost hunting gear. I found myself sprinting across the nightmare landscape, snatching up EMF meters and infrared cameras as I went. All around me, the phantom soldiers began to stir once again, their movements growing more frenzied and erratic. As I ran, I felt a strange doubling of my vision. One moment I was dodging musket fire and cannon blasts. The next I was stumbling through overgrown weeds in the present day. The two realities seemed to be combining, fighting for dominance, and through it all that sickly green light pulsed stronger and stronger. I reunited with the others at the edge of the vortex, our arms full of equipment. The abomination loomed before us, its countless eyes fixed upon our small group with malevolent intelligence. "Now what?" Hans shouted over the rising wind that whipped around us. "We've got to overload it," Greta called back, her earlier shock seemingly forgotten. "Turn everything on at once. Push it to the limit." As one, we activated each piece of equipment we had. The air filled with the shriek of feedback and the whine of overtaxed electronics. The abomination recoiled, its form rippling and distorting even more violently than before. But it wasn't enough. Even as we poured every ounce of energy we could into the makeshift weapon, I could see the creature beginning to push back. The vortex was widening, the boundaries between worlds growing thinner by the second. In desperation, I pulled out the Confederate belt buckle. "Klaus, you said this place was a nexus of timelines. What if we could use something from the past to stabilize the present?" Understanding dawned in his eyes. Without a word, he snatched the buckle from my hand and hurled it directly into the heart of the vortex. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the swirling energies began to collapse. The abomination let out a shriek that threatened to shatter our eardrums, its form beginning to unravel. "It's working," Hans yelled triumphantly. "Keep pushing." We redoubled our efforts, forcing every last bit of power through our equipment. The vortex continued to shrink, dragging the writhing form of the abomination back into whatever hellish dimension it had emerged from. And then, with a final earth-shaking roar, it was gone. The vortex snapped shut, leaving behind nothing but a scorched patch of earth and the lingering scent of ozone. We stood there, panting and shell-shocked, as reality settled back into place around us. The phantom soldiers had vanished, leaving behind only the overgrown field and the dilapidated farmhouse that we had once encountered. Is it over?" Greta asked hesitantly, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over us. Before any of us could answer, a low and ominous rumble began to emanate from beneath our feet. The ground trembled, and in the distance we could see storm clouds gathering with unnatural speed. "I don't think so," Klaus said grimly. "I fear we've only delayed the inevitable. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, still trying to break through." Hans nodded in agreement. "We need to warn someone, the authorities, other paranormal researchers, anyone who might be able to help prevent this from happening again." As we gathered our scattered equipment and made our way back to our vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The weight of unseen eyes seemed to press down on us, and whispers just beyond the edges of our hearing teased at our senses. We had survived our encounter with the unknown, but at what cost? What horrors still awaited us in the battles to come? As we drove away from that accursed place, I knew with grim certainty that our war against the darkness had just begun. The road ahead stretched out before us, leading into an uncertain and terrifying future, but we would face it together, armed with the knowledge we had gained and the unshakable bond forged in the crucible of cosmic horror, for we are ghost hunters, and our hunt continues. As our vehicle sped away from the haunted battlefield, an oppressive silence settled over all of us. Each lost in our own thoughts, we grappled with the cosmic horror that we had witnessed, and the chilling knowledge that our ordeal was far from over. The countryside blurred past the windows. The encroaching darkness seemed to swallow the last vestiges of daylight. It was Greta who finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't just leave. Whatever that was, that thing, it's still out there. We have a responsibility to stop it." Hans gripped the steering wheel even tighter, his knuckles white. "And how do you propose we do that, Greta? We barely escaped with our lives. We've no equipment to handle something of that magnitude." "No one is," Klaus interjected, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But Hans is right about one thing. We need to warn others. There are organizations, secret societies that deal with threats like this. I have connections from my time with the clergy." I turned to Klaus, surprised. In all our years of working together, he had never mentioned such connections. "What kind of organization?" I asked. "The kind that operates in the shadows, Wilhelm. The kind that guards humanity against threats most people couldn't even comprehend. I had hoped never to contact them again, but... He trailed off, his expression grim. As if in response to Klaus's ominous words, a flash of green lightning split the sky, followed by a roll of thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Hans swerved, nearly sending us off the road. "Mein Gott, it's following us," he said. I cranked my neck to look out the rear window. What I saw chilled me to my core. A wall of roiling storm clouds was rapidly gaining on us, shot through with pulses of that sickly green energy we had come to associate with the abomination. And within those clouds, I could have sworn I saw shapes forming and dissolving, grotesque, writhing forms that defied description. "Hans, I think you'd better drive faster." As Hans pressed down on the accelerator, Greta rummaged through her bag, pulling out a worn, leather-bound tome. "There might be something in here," she said, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. "It's an old family grimoire. I've never fully understood all of it, but there are protection spells, banishing rituals." "Now you tell us about this," Hans snapped, his usual skepticism forgotten in the face of our dire situation. "I didn't think we needed it," Greta shot back. "Most of our investigations have been, well, mundane compared to this. Restless spirits, local legends, nothing like..." She gestured helplessly at the encroaching storm behind us. As Greta continued to search her book, I noticed Klaus had closed his eyes, his lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. The words I caught didn't sound like any prayer I'd ever heard, though. They were in a language far older, far stranger. Suddenly, Klaus's eyes snapped open. "There," he said, pointing to a dirt road barely visible in the gathering gloom. "Turn there, Hans." "Are you insane? That leads back towards the woods. We need to go to town, to people." "Trust me," Klaus insisted, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "That road will take us where we need to go." Perhaps it was the desperation of our situation, or perhaps some part of us recognized the ring of truth in Klaus's words. Whatever the reason, Hans wrenched the wheel, sending us bumping down the narrow dirt track. As we plunged deeper into the forest, the canopy above us grew thicker, blocking out what little light remained. The storm seemed to recede, but the oppressive feeling of being watched, of being hunted, only intensified. After what felt like hours, but could have only been minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a decrepit church, its spires listing dangerously to one side. "Stop here," Klaus commanded, already reaching for the door handle before Hans had fully put on the brakes. We piled out of the vehicle, the silence of the forest pressing in around us. No birds sang, no insects chirped. It was as if all of nature was holding its breath. "Klaus, what is this place?" He didn't answer immediately, instead striding purposefully towards the church's weathered doors. "A sanctuary, or perhaps our only hope." As we approached, I noticed some strange symbols carved into the wood of the door, sigils and runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed at different angles. Klaus placed his hand on the center of the door, murmuring words in that same ancient language he had used earlier. With a groan of protest, the wood and rusted metal swung open. The interior of the church was not what I had expected. Instead of pews and an altar, the vast space was filled with bookshelves, stretching from floor to ceiling. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that seemed to have no visible source. At the far end, where a crucifix might hang, there was an enormous stained glass window depicting a scene of cosmic chaos, swirling galaxies, eldritch entities, and at the center, a blazing eye that seemed to stare directly into my soul. "Welcome to the sanctum of the cosmic sigil," Klaus said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Greta gasped, her eyes wide with recognition. "I've heard whispers of this place. a repository of forbidden knowledge guarded by those who stand watch against the great old ones. Hans, for once, seemed at a loss for words. He wandered to the nearest bookshelf, running his fingers over the spine of an ancient tome. "This is impossible. I'm afraid it's all too real. And now, my friends, we have a choice to make. We can walk away from this and try to forget what we've seen, or we can take up the mantle of the vigil and stand against the darkness that threatens to consume our world." As if in answer, a tremor ran through the building. The stained glass windows blazed with an inner light, and I could have sworn I saw the great eye blink. "I don't think walking away is an option anymore," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. "Whatever's out there, whatever has awakened, it's not going to stop coming for us, or for anyone else." Greta nodded firmly. "Wilhelm's right. We have a duty to use what we've learned to fight back." We all turned to Hans, the eternal skeptic. He stood silent for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "I suppose if we're going to face cosmic horrors, we might as well do it with the best resources available." Klaus smiled, but it was a grim expression. "Then let us begin. We have much to learn and precious little time." As Klaus led us deeper into the sanctum, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Our lives as simple ghost hunters were over. We were embarking on a new path, one fraught with danger beyond imagining. But as I looked at my companions, Hans the skeptic turned believer, Greta, her family's arcane knowledge finding new purpose, and Klaus, the man of faith who had kept earth-shattering secrets, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever horrors awaited us in the vast, uncaring cosmos, we would face them together. The ghost hunters had evolved. No longer mere hunters of ghosts, we were now guardians against forces that threatened the very fabric of reality. Our war against the darkness had truly begun, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. As we delved into the ancient texts and eldritch artifacts of the sanctum, preparing for battle, one thought echoed in my mind. The hunt continues, but the stakes have never been higher. As we immersed ourselves in the arcane knowledge of the sanctum, days blurred into weeks. The outside world seemed to fade away, our existence narrowing to the dusty tomes and eldritch artifacts that surrounded us. Each revelation brought new horrors, but also new understanding. Hans, once the voice of skepticism, now pored over quantum theory texts, alongside grimoires of forbidden magic, muttering about the thin line between science and sorcery. Greta's expertise in occult history found a new depth as she uncovered connections between ancient cults and cosmic entities that spanned millennia. Klaus guided us through the sanctum's secrets, his past as a former priest taking on new significance with each passing day. I found myself drawn to prophecies, cryptic verses, and maddening visions that hinted at the greater conflict to come. It was in one such text, a crumbling papyrus written in a language that predated human civilization, that I found our first real lead. Listen to this. "When the stars align and the veils grow thin, the hunger that waits beneath the world shall reach forth. Its tendrils shall grasp at the threads of reality, and the tapestry of existence shall begin to unravel." Klaus looked up from the star chart he'd been studying, his face grave. "That sounds unsettlingly familiar to what we witnessed." Greta nodded, leafing through her own notes. "The alignment. There's a rare celestial event coming up, a convergence of planets that only happen once every 1,000 years. "And let me guess," Hans interjected, his voice tinged with grim humor, "it's happening soon." 3 days from now," Greta confirmed. A heavy sigh fell from all of us. The entity we had encountered, this hunger that waits beneath the worlds, had only been testing the boundaries of our reality. The true invasion was yet to come. "We need to go back," I said, words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Back to that battlefield. It's a weak point, a nexus where the barriers between worlds are already strained." Klaus nodded solemnly. "Agreed, but we can't go in unprepared like last time. We need to gather allies, weapons, anything that might give us the edge." As if in response to his words, a section of bookshelf swung open, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside, illuminated by an otherworldly glow, was an arsenal unlike anything I had ever seen. Ancient swords inscribed with runes of power, firearms that hummed with barely contained energy, amulets and talismans from a dozen different centuries, all radiating a palpable aura of protection. "The Vigil has been preparing for this moment for centuries," Klaus explained as we stared in awe. "We are not the first to stand against the darkness, nor will we be the last. But we may be the last line of defense for our world." As we began to arm ourselves, a thought occurred to me. What about the local authorities, the government? Surely they must have noticed something by now. Hans laughed bitterly. "Oh, I'm sure they have, but what could they do against something like this? No, it's better they remain ignorant. Mass panic would only make our job harder." Over the next 2 days we prepared as best we could. Greta worked tirelessly on protection wards and banishing rituals. Hans modified our ghost hunting equipment, infusing it with eldritch energy we scarcely understood. Klaus reached out to his contacts in the Vigil, calling in every favor he could to gather what allies were available on such short notice. I delved deeper into the prophecies, searching for any clues, any weaknesses we could exploit against the cosmic horrors that threatened our world. As the hours and the alignment drew near, we made our way back to Virginia. The countryside seemed unchanged, peaceful enough, but we all felt the wrongness that permeated the air. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp around the old battlefield, like space folding in on itself. We set up our equipment in a rough circle around the spot where the vortex had first appeared. Allies from the Vigil, a motley crew of scholars and warriors and mystics from around the globe, took up positions at key points, ready to lend their strength to whatever ritual we might need to perform. As the planets began to align, the air grew thick with tension. The sickly green light that we had come to dread began to pulse beneath the earth, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Whatever happens," I said to my companions, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me, "it has been an honor to stand with you." Greta squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with determination. Hans nodded grimly, his customary skepticism replaced by steely resolve. Klaus smiled, a look of peace settling over his features. "We stand now at the threshold, guardians against the darkness, sentinels against the void. Whatever horror may come, we face it together for the sake of all we hold dear." As if in response to his words, the ground began to split open. The vortex of green energy erupted skyward, tearing a hole in the very fabric of reality. Through that hole, we caught our first glimpse of the hunger that waits between worlds. It was vast beyond comprehension, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes and mouths that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. As it began to push into our world, I felt my sanity straining at the seams. But we had come prepared this time. As one, we raised our weapons, channeling our energies, and began the ritual that would determine the fate of the world. The battle for reality itself had begun, and we, the ghost hunters, stood as humanity's last desperate hope. The cosmic entity surged forward, its countless appendages lashing in all directions. The air filled with an otherworldly shriek that threatened to shatter our eardrums and break our minds, but we held firm, our protective wards flaring to life as they absorbed the brunt of the assault. Greta's voice rose above the chaos, chanting words of power that seemed to make the air vibrate. Hans directed bursts of modified electromagnetic energy at the creature, causing sections of its vast form to ripple and distort. Klaus stood at the center of our formation, his arms raised, channeling the combined might of the vigil through ancient artifacts that we had brought from the sanctum. And me, I found myself locked in a mental battle with the entity itself. As our allies fought to contain its physical form, I grappled with its alien consciousness, trying to find some weakness, some way to drive it back. Images flashed through my mind, entire worlds consumed, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye, the cold, uncaring vastness of a universe far longer and more terrifying than we had ever imagined. But among the cosmic horrors, I caught a glimpse of something, a pattern, a rhythm, an underlying structure of reality itself. A resonance, I shouted. We need to match its frequency. Understanding dawned on Hans's face. He quickly adjusted our equipment, turning it to the cosmic frequency I had glimpsed in my mental struggle. The air around us began to hum, a counterpart to the maddening shrieks of the entity. As our energies aligned, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had ever experienced. For a brief, eternal moment, we were connected, not just to each other, but to the very fabric of the universe. Through that connection, we pushed back against the hunger that waits between worlds. The entity recoiled, its vast form beginning to collapse in on itself. The vortex of energy that had torn open reality started to shrink, drawing the cosmic horror back into whatever nightmare realm it had emerged from. Our victory, though, was not without cost. As the last of the entity was pulled back through the closing portal, I saw Klaus crumble, blood trickling from his nose and ears, the strain of channeling so much power taking its toll. "Klaus!" Greta cried out, rushing to support him. He smiled weakly, his eyes unfocused. "It's done. The barrier is sealed, but not forever. It will try again." As Klaus slumped into Greta's arms, the last of the otherworldly energy dissipated. The battlefield fell silent, the only sound our ragged breathing and the faint moans of the wounded. We had won, for now. The immediate threat was contained, but as I looked at my exhausted companions, at the allies who had fought beside us, I knew that our war was far from over. The hunger that waits between worlds had been driven back, but not destroyed. And there were other threats out there, other cosmic horrors waiting for their chance to break through reality. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a silent vow. We would recover, we would learn, and we would grow stronger, for we were no longer simple ghost hunters, tracking down local legends and restless spirits. We had become something more, guardians of reality, sentinels against the darkness that lurked between the stars. And our hunt, our endless vigil would continue, for the sake of our worlds and all worlds that might exist beyond our understanding. We would stand ready, always watching, always fighting, always hunting the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of our fragile reality. The sun rose on a world that had no idea how close it had come to annihilation, and in the growing light we began to plan our next move in a war that might never truly end. In the days that followed our confrontation, the true cost of our victory became painfully clear. Klaus, weakened by the immense energy of the channeling, slipped away peacefully in his sleep. His sacrifice had sealed the breach, but at the ultimate price. We weren't the only ones to suffer losses. Many of our allies from the Vigil fell in battle, their names to be honored in the secret annals of our organization. Greta, overcome with grief at the horrors that she had witnessed, chose to sequester herself in a remote monastery, seeking solace in ancient texts and meditation. Hans, ever the scientist, threw himself into studying the artifacts and knowledge that we had gathered, but the strain proved too much for such a rational mind. I received word that he had been institutionalized, his brilliant intellect shattered by truths that no human was meant to comprehend. As for me, I couldn't simply walk away. The things I had seen, the knowledge I now possessed, they were burdens, but also a responsibility. I took up Klaus's mantle, working to rebuild the vigil, to prepare for future incursions. Years passed, the world spun on, blissfully unaware of the sacrifice made to keep it safe. I grew older, wearier, but never let my guard down, for I knew the truth. Our victories had been temporary. The cosmic horrors were patient, eternal. They could afford to wait. On the 10th anniversary of our battle, I returned to that Virginia field. The scars of our conflict had long since faded, nature reclaiming the land. As I stood there, remembering fallen friends and the weight of secrets, I felt a familiar tremor in the air. A faint green glow began to emanate from the ground, pulsing like a distant heartbeat. The hunger that waits beneath the worlds had not forgotten us. It was testing the barrier once again, probing for weakness. I sighed, feeling the weight of years and knowledge pressing down upon me. This was to be my life now, an eternal vigilance against threats beyond imagination. As I reached for my phone to alert the vigil, I allowed myself a grim smile. The hunt, it seemed, would never truly end, but as long as I drew breath, as long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, humanity would have a fighting chance. Perhaps, in the great cosmic scheme of things, that was victory enough. With one last look at the peaceful fields that belied its true nature, I turned and walked away. There was work to be done, preparation to be made, for the next battle in our secret endless war loomed on the horizon, and I would be ready.